Aloha mai kako and welcome to Hawaiian History Month, produced by the Hawaii Pono Coalition, celebrating the 183rd birthday of Queen Liliuokalani. This is the second program of the Hanakeaka Week, Theater Week, called Na Huliau, Turning Points on Stage. It's also the last program of Hawaiian History Month 2021. We're so glad to have everyone here. You may be wondering why theater in a Hawaiian History Month program. Well, for over a decade, the Hawaii Pono Coalition has helped keep Hawaiian history alive in the minds of Hawaii's residents by celebrating the Queen's birthday and with other educational events. One of its signature events has been the presentation of 3 living history plays by Victoria Nalani Kneubuhl. The living history is a type of theatrical presentation intended to educate viewers at museums, historical sites, and schools, for instance, about events or conditions in the past. Sometimes actors are in costume, and this gives the audience a sense of stepping back in time. And historic reenactment can be a really effective educational technique, fostering an understanding of a particular history. Now, these 3 Hawaiian plays each examine a significant historical event of the late 19th century. The Overthrow in 1893, the 1895 military...
Kalamai, Sammy.
Yeah.
The Zoom room did not open up, so we're gonna have to restart. Sorry.
Okay.
Kalamai.
Is my volume okay?
Yeah, audio's perfect. I'll let you know in the chat once again when to begin.
Okay.
Good run through.
Thank you. Aloha mai kako, and welcome to Hawaiian History Month 2021, produced by the Hawaii Pono Coalition, celebrating the 183rd birthday of Queen Liliuokalani. This is the second of the Hanakeaka Week programs, Hanakeaka or Theater Week programs. It's called Na Huliau, Turning Points on Stage. It's also the last of the Hawaiian History Month programs for this year. You may be wondering why have a week focusing on theater when we're talking about Hawaiian history? Well, for over a decade, the Hawaii Pono Coalition has helped keep Hawaiian history alive in the minds of Hawaii's residents by celebrating the Queen's birthday and with other educational events. One of its signature events has been the presentation of 3 living history plays by playwright Victoria Nalani Kneubuhl. Now, living history is a type of theatrical presentation intended to educate viewers at museums, at historical sites, and schools, for instance. Actors are sometimes in costume, and this gives the audience a sense of stepping back in time. And the historic reenactments they watch can be an effective tool in fostering an understanding of a particular history. These 3 Hawaiian plays each examine a significant historical event of the late 19th century. The Overthrow in 1893, the 1895 military tribunal following the unsuccessful effort to restore Queen Liliuokalani to the throne, and the Native Hawaiian struggle against the 1898 annexation of the then Republic of Hawaii to the United States. These events are Huliau. They are turning points in Hawaii's history. With these theatrical productions, audiences are reminded, or sometimes they learn for the very first time, Hawaii's history through the experiences of Native Hawaiians from the past. Sometimes the actors play known historical figures, sometimes they represent composites or of people from the period. But the plays have this in common. They deliberately share a view of history as experienced and perceived by Native Hawaiians, their allies, and their adversaries of the period. This video that you're about to see brings back some of the actors who've appeared in the 3 living history plays to revisit monologues they've performed on stage. After the video, we'll be bringing on 3 special guests to offer responses to the theatrical presentation and reflect on what can be learned from the past as Hawaii nears potential turning points now.
The first 2 monologues come from My Poina, The Overthrow. In this play, characters offer their opinions about what is happening in the kingdom in the time of the 1893 overthrow. The first character is a Chinese citizen of the kingdom who tells us how much has changed since the Bayonet Constitution of 1887. Mr. Asing is played by John Wat. Second, a living history interpreter, Wil Kahele, explains what has happened on January 17, 1893, and reveals why the Queen has decided to temporarily yield her throne.
I remember those those certain Howley businessmen. They threatened the king, forced him to sign that paper. Yeah, you know, they threatened him. And that paper, they call one constitution. They only made it up a few days before. They never asked the cabinet ministers, they never asked the legislature. They just wrote it and forced the king to sign. And then they say it's legal because the king signed. But everybody knows they force him. That's why they call it Bayonet Constitution. And then there's all these changes. They make House of Nobles seats equal to House of Representatives seats. And then hardly anybody can vote for House of Nobles. To qualify, you have to have $3,000 taxable property or $600 salary every year. You know, the most high-paid Hawaiians only makes about $250 a year. So only rich people, who everyone knows are mostly white people, can vote for House of Nobles. And you don't even have to be one subject. You don't have to be citizen. You only have to live here 3 years and then swear allegiance to the Bayonet Constitution, and you can vote. So planning Hawaiians and other citizens no can vote, but rich foreign Howleys can. House of Representatives, you just have to be taxpayer and able to read and write Hawaiian, or other European language. But you know what really makes me mad? Before I could vote, you see, under the Constitution of 1864, I could vote, but now no can, because under the Bayonet Constitution, only Hawaiians, Americans, or the Europeans can vote. Even though I live here a long time, even though I'm a loyal citizen of the kingdom, even though I can read and write English, I cannot vote because I'm Chinese. And now, yet plenty of Portuguese people can vote, even though they cannot read English. But just because they're white people, they could vote. You know why? Because that Mr. Thurston and those Reform Party people, they counting on the Portuguese vote. Those businessmen who forced the king to sign, they want this place to themselves. They want to take the country away from the Hawaiians. And they don't like us Chinese either. They're always calling us greedy and threatening. We're not the ones threatening. We're good citizens. We respect the queen. They're the greedy ones. They're the ones who threaten everybody, I tell you.
On Tuesday, January 17th, 1893, the Queen's ministers met with the American minister and asked him to clarify his actions. They did not receive any clear answer. They came back to the palace and drafted a request to Minister Stevens asking for his assistance in maintaining the monarchy. At 2 p.m., Minister Stevens received a communique from the Queen, assuring him that she would uphold the Constitution of 1887. This was the third such proclamation that he had received in the last 3 days. In the meantime, the Committee of Public Safety was over at the Armory. They had put their finishing touches on their documents. Their plan was to go with armed support to Liliuokalani, take over the building and read their statement. At about the same time, a distracting incident happened over at Fort Street. A Hawaiian policeman was shot trying to stop the delivery of ammunition to the Armory. At 2:30 p.m., the Committee of Public Safety, along with 15 members of the German Shooting Club, scouted out Liliuokalani. Finding it relatively empty, they read their proclamation in a furtive and secret gathering. Then they went immediately to ask Minister Stevens for recognition and aid. At about 2:45 p.m., Minister Stevens received a request from the Queen's cabinet asking for his help in maintaining the monarchy. At 3:10 p.m., American Minister John L. Stevens sent a message to the Station House saying that he had recognized the provisional government of the Committee of Public Safety as a de facto or existing government. The cabinet ministers and many loyal, prominent citizens advised the Queen to temporarily yield her authority under protest, not to the provisional government, to US forces. Their reasoning based on the obvious use of US troops to intimidate and give the appearance that the provisional government had the support of US troops. By temporarily yielding her authority to the United States, the Queen would be entitled to what she thought would be a fair and just hearing. The following is a statement from the Queen. I, Liliuokalani, by the grace of God and under Constitution of the Hawaiian Kingdom, Queen, do hereby solemnly protest against any and all acts done against myself and the constitutional government of the Hawaiian Kingdom by certain persons claiming to have established of and for this kingdom. That I yield to the superior force, the United States of America, whose Minister Plenipotentiary, His Excellency John L. Stevens, has caused United States troops to be landed at Honolulu and declared that he would support the said provisional government. Not to avoid any collision of armed forces and perhaps loss of life, I do, under this protest and impelled by said forces, yield my authority until such time as the government of the United States shall, on the facts being presented to it, undo the actions of its representative, and reinstate me in the authority which I claim as constitutional sovereign. And we can only hope that the government of the United States of America will right the wrongs done here and give us back our kingdom and our people.
In 1894, an armed group of royalists, supporters of the monarchy, attempted to overthrow the Republic of Hawaiian and restore the Queen to the throne. They were unsuccessful, and many were arrested, tried, convicted, and imprisoned, including Queen Liliuʻokalani, who was accused of misprision of treason. That's considered of a treasonable act or a felony. Her trial is the subject of The Trial of the Queen. The monologue you'll hear is by Mathias Maas, playing William A. Kinney, the judge advocate who prosecuted the Queen. This is his final argument.
May it please the gentlemen of the commission. We submit that we have proven that the 13 counts of treason were within the guilty knowledge of the accused, constituting the crime of misprision of treason. Now, it is not denied that one of the 4 leaders who carried out this conspiracy, working actively and earnestly night and day, housed under the roof of innocence as her confidential servant and advisor. The very man who was to pass word along to everybody on the island of Oahu to do the work when it came time to do it. Well, the mistress of the house pursued a path of peace and diplomatic discussion. Her headman, her confidential advisor, was pursuing a path of peace with a bucket full of bombs and a rubbish pile full of rifles, all at his disposal, all under the house of the accused. And we are told on that Thursday night, her household staff, 40 in number, armed to the teeth, surrounded her in the pursuit of peace and diplomatic discussion. And she knew nothing of it. The evidence shows there was 200 men in the field, over 40 in the Queen's yard, 50 out of 400 rifles hidden there, along with ample ammunition and most of the bombs. So within this pursuit of peace and diplomacy and discussion and avoidance of internal strife, an assurance that had she known of this venture, she would have persuaded the promoters from it. Within this was hidden such an arsenal of weapons. God forbid if the woman turned her mind to war instead of peace. I mean, if these are the traits of peace, let us take on open war. Does this commission believe that if those men were armed that night, that Thursday night, that the accused knew nothing of it? There is an irresistible presumption she knew what was going on. Over 2/3 ripened in her own yard, under her own roof. And this whole defense, I submit to the gentlemen of the commission, cannot be raised above the dignity of a common police court defense in a petty larceny suit. Gentlemen, there has been some remarkable advice given to these native rulers. And looking back at this hour, it must strike them with particular force. It is a matter of history that the royal brother of the lady who stands here wrecked his throne with a carefully drawn up opium bill and an outrageous opium bribery backed by white men lost to the light. The attitude of the learned counsel is on par with the guilty advice of the past. I mean, if counsel, through association with those charged with treason or the accused, has mingled their confessions or blended in his mind their ideas of their guilt or his idea of treason that he doesn't know where he stands, well and good. But to charge here that a government in an hour like this cannot do what has been done with a provocation that the Republic has had is simply rot. There's a great deal of heroic written on that paper. She waives the right to immunity or any consideration for herself. But the lady knows, if she knows anything, that with the men she is dealing with, it'll be considered for what it is worth. She knows, as all men know, that the purpose of government is not to gratify personal vengeance or spite against her, but simply to prevent a repetition in the next 2 years of the pursuit of peace and diplomatic discussion such as she has pursued in the last 2 years. And other than that, we do not intend to raise our hand to harm her. This may do very well for extra editions of the newspapers abroad. It may have an effect there, but it won't have an effect here, either to help her or hurt her. What this present government wants is peace. It is looking for peace with eyes still strained and turned toward the mother country, under whom this country has moved, lived, and had its being, with the belief that ere long her eyes will be open and she will take us onto herself and give us the peace and prosperity which she stood for in the past and which we hope will be so in the future, and give to us all that is right and just and restore prosperity and peace to this land. She has reminded us, and it is well to put it to the commission, that she is a woman, and much that is written here may well be passed by, leaving for your consideration if this is any statement to make for the charge for which she is on trial. I submit to the commission by all the rules of evidence, she is guilty of the charge preferred against her and should be so found.
Almost all the characters in the annexation debate are notable figures from both Hawaiian and United States history, both for and against annexation. Directly following the 1893 overthrow, the businessmen in control of the provisional government attempted to engineer annexation to the US. Their first efforts were blocked, and it was not until 1898 that the illegal annexation took place. In the intervening years, Native Hawaiians had fought against annexation, and the new government fought equally hard for it. In the first speech from the annexation debate, Craig Howes plays William O. Smith, missionary son and active participant in the overthrow, who lobbies influential and powerful men in Washington, D.C. to annex the islands to the US. Many Native Hawaiians, however, were opposed to annexation. In 1898, a reporter from the San Francisco Call visited Hilo. She witnessed a community mass meeting at which Hawaiian women were urged to sign anti-annexation petitions. An influential leader from Honolulu was present at this meeting, Emma Aima Navahi. In this selection from our final play, Lala Buzzell plays reporter Miriam Michelson, and Maki Ilei Shihara plays Emma Navahi.
Gentlemen, Hawaii is a small country, too small to exist on its own in these uncertain times. As a means of securing democracy in the islands and keeping it under the influence of the United States of America, we sincerely desire annexation to this great nation. It is the deepest desire of the Republic of Hawaii that we become part of America. We consider ourselves Americans, first, by our history, and second, by the natural ties that we have in our quest for freedom from tyranny. As many of you gentlemen know, it was American missionaries who guided the islands out of the primitive darkness and into the dawn of civilization. So it is only natural that now, America, having prepared us, should take us into the fold. For we have fought to accomplish the very things which America, in its glorious formation, sought to accomplish: the release of her people from the odious anti-Republican regime, which denies to her people the right to govern themselves and subordinates them to the supposed divine right of a monarch whose title to such divinity originated in the most slavish conditions of pagan barbarity. Now, as an independent republic, we face a threat from which we need protection. So far, we have been free from overt aggression, but every day, our fears of an Asian invasion seem closer to being realized. I'm speaking, gentlemen, of the peaceful invasion of Japanese immigrants, which many of us feel is the precursor to making our islands a Japanese colony. As you know, Japan has become an aggressive nation, one which we fear seeks supremacy in the Pacific. And where better to control the Pacific than from our excellently placed islands? And we are praying that America will take us before it is too late. It would be to her great advantage. America would strengthen itself and ensure protection of US trade by annexing Hawaii, if only for military reasons. A nation controlling Hawaii virtually controls naval operations in the Pacific. Why, with Hawaii as a base, ships at sea could be supported from Panama to Hong Kong and from Alaska to Tahiti. We feel surely that as God sent those first missionaries to the shores of the Hawaiian Islands, that God has ordained this event before us, the union of the Hawaiian Islands to the United States of America through a treaty of annexation.
Let me take you back to September of 1897 to a Salvation Army Hall at Hilo on the island of Hawaii. Hilo, as you know, is set amidst a verdant and lush landscape with a majestic backdrop of two lofty mountains. It was a rough little place, this simple hall, which held around 300 people. The uncovered rafters shone above, and the only relief on the bare wooden walls were scriptural admonitions. As I entered the hall, a distant church bell was striking 10. The hall was packed with Hawaiians, and outside stood an equally large patient crowd unable to enter. Although it was a women's meeting, there were many men present. The atmosphere was charged with excitement and expectation. Presently, the crowd parted and two women walked in, both very tall and elegantly dressed in handsome gowns of black crepe with large black straw hats decorated with black feathers. These women were Mrs. Kawēlauokealoha Campbell of the Women's Hawaiian Patriotic League and Mrs. Emma Navahi of its executive committee in Honolulu. The reception of these two women was clearly notable in the faces of the crowd. An almost adoring fondness in the eyes of the women and an absorbed interest on the part of the men. I watched Mrs. Navahi closely as she rose to speak, for I'm always interested to see how a woman will speak in public. As you know, even in America, it is still somewhat of a novelty. How would this Hawaiian woman speak? Would she be timid, self-conscious, or assertive? To my surprise, she was none of these. Her manner held the simple directness that 2 years ago made Charlotte Perkins Gilman the most interesting speaker at the Women's Congress. But Mrs. Navahi went beyond Mrs. Gilman's pretense of simplicity. Her thoughts were purely on her subject and not on herself. She thoroughly held the complete attention of all.
We are few people, we Hawaiians, and we have no power unless we all stand together. The United States is just, a land of liberty. The people are the friends, the greatest friends of the weak. Let us tell them, let us show them that as they love their country and would suffer much before giving it up, so do we love our Hawaii and pray that they do not take it from us. Our only hope is in standing firm, shoulder to shoulder, heart to heart. In this petition, which we offer for your signature today, you, the women of Hawaii, have the chance to speak your mind. The men's petition will be sent on by the men's club as soon as the loyal men of Honolulu have signed it. There is nothing underhanded, nothing deceitful in our way, our only way of fighting. Everybody may know and see our petition. We have nothing to conceal. We have right on our side. This is our land, our Hawaii. Stand firm, my friends. Love of country means more to you and me than anything else. Be brave, be strong, have courage and patience. Our time will come. Sign this petition. Those of you who love Hawaii. How many? How many will sign?
She held up a gloved hand as she spoke, and in a moment, the palms of hundreds of hands were turned toward her. Eloquent, deep-lined, dark-lined hands that told of work and contact with the soil of the land they claimed. Next, the woman who was presiding said a few words, and suddenly all eyes were turned on me. What is it? I asked my interpreter. She told them a reporter was here. Tell her how you feel, she said, so Americans will know and listen. One by one, men and women rose, and in a sentence or two made a fervent profession of faith. This is my feeling, said one. I love my country and I want to be independent. And my feeling is the same, said another. And soon voices from everywhere. I'm strongly opposed to annexation. This birthplace I love as the American loves his. My father is American, my mother Hawaiian, but it is my mother's country I love. And on, these men and women rose quickly to tell me, with no study or self-consciousness on their part, how vital and dear they held their nationality and country. I barely believe that even the most virulent of annexationists, had he witnessed what I did, would have thought the wishes of these people most worthy of consideration. The sad fact is that Senator Morgan and his party did not bother, did not care to know the truth if it did not fit with their own ideas of annexation.
Mahalo nui to Kanai Okana for putting that video together, and mahalo to all of you for your patience as we dealt with our technical issues. We're going to go now into a panel discussion. We have three distinguished scholars here. I'm going to briefly introduce each of them, and then they have short statements, introductory statements to give. Our first one is Kawēlauokealoha Wright. She is a PhD candidate in the Geography Department at UH Manoa. She has earned MA degrees in Hawaiian Studies and Geography, and is a Kamakakuʻokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies faculty member. Areas of her research include Hawaii's territorial period with a focus on land, tenure, and law. Our second panelist is Kealani Cook, Assistant Professor of History at University of Hawaii, West Oahu. Originally from Waimea, Hawaii Island, his published work, including his book, Return to Kahiki, Native Hawaiians in Oceania, focuses on ties between Hawaii and the Pacific. Our last panelist is Noenoe K. Silva, Professor of Indigenous Politics at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and author of Aloha Betrayed, Native Hawaiian Resistance to American Colonialism, and The Power of the Steel-Tipped Pen, Reconstructing Native Hawaiian Intellectual History. So welcome to all three of you. Thank you for giving part of your evening to us here. So let's go right into your reactions. Kawēlau, I believe you're first.
Thank you very much. Aloha mai kākou. So I guess watching these monologues, really acting was superb, first of all. I think there's a couple of things that struck me. One is that I think that we all need to remember that a lot of this history was covered up, right? And really, thanks to the work of Noenoe Silva, as well as Kealani, right? We're having this sort of resurgence. It's kind of uncovering all that's been erased. And I think that when we're looking at this time period, it's important to remember that this time frame, right, which is just after the illegal overthrow in 1893, saw a lot of things happening in a very, very short time. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that in 1895, which is when the counter-revolution happens, which is related to the monologue where the tribunal is going on, right? They had enacted, when I say they, I'm talking about the provisional government, the people that overthrew the Hawaiian Kingdom government. They enacted what's called the 1895 Land Act. And basically what this Land Act did was it took Kingdom era land laws and turned them upside down on their heads. There were a number, it's quite a long act. There's lots of content in them, but some of the things that I just wanted to point out was this is the legislation that ended up combining crown lands with government lands and then renaming that land bank public lands, even though really nothing is very public about them. But this is the bank of land that they end up using to begin to lure white Anglo-Saxons from America here to Hawaii. And really the reason that they're doing that, I mean, what the monologue where Craig Howes was playing W.O. Smith, he's talking about the Japanese and what a threat they pose. I think that this was really at the forefront of the provisional government leaders, is that they were a very, very small, at the time, they're a very small segment of the population. And so they are really operating this, they've done the overthrow, they're operating this government and without very much population to back them. And so one of the things that this 1895 Land Act does is try to lure white people from America here using cheap land. The other thing that I think is important to sort of think about is this 1895 Land Act also made the development of Waikiki possible. Okay, the development of Waikiki doesn't happen until the 1920s, but the original legislation that allows for this to happen was passed in 1895. And for those of you who don't know Waikiki's history, there was more than 1,400 acres of wet agricultural and aquacultural food production areas that were pretty much filled in and made into what we know as the paradise of others that we see in the landscape today. Now, Native Hawaiians and citizens, of course, which weren't just Native Hawaiians, right? Think about the first monologue with that Chinese gentleman. They were really disenfranchised in these laws, and they did this in a number of different ways, but I just wanted to mention a couple of them so that you're aware of them. One was that to be considered for land programs, right? Because they're taking this public land bank and they are sort of selling it off to foreigners, and some people that are here in the kingdom are able to take advantage of this, but there were a couple of things. One was that they needed to take an oath of allegiance to be considered for these land programs. And so if we think about the Ku'e petitions, right, and how 90% of the Native Hawaiian population ends up signing their name to these anti-annexation petitions, all of those people would have been very, I'm assuming, unlikely to be willing to take the oath of allegiance to the provisional government and republic. So those are just the things that sort of bubbled up to me. And please let me know if you have any questions. Mahalo nui.
Mahalo nui to you. And Kealani, move you up.
Okay, yeah, mahalo for that. So I just wanted to, one of the things when I was watching the video that kind of struck me was that how prominent a role white supremacy is playing in all of these. And it's not just like a quiet underlying white supremacy. They're pretty open about this in most of the stuff that's going on. Less so in the trial, which is it's PR for the PG, of course. So they're not going to be in this trial screaming out like, and by the way, this is for the white people, because this is PR for them. They're not going to do that. But in a lot of other cases, we can see, we can really see how white supremacy is popping up in all these different monologues and speeches in different ways. And this is something that's not just specific to what's going on in Hawaii. I mean, this is something that's being pretty widely embraced in the United States, North and South, in this sort of post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction agreement, that it's a pretty wide agreement, especially among white elites, in support of white supremacy as the basis for American rule at home and American rule in this new empire that they're creating. And we can, there's in W.O. Smith's comments on the Japanese, we can see right there that he's explicitly talking about like this, well, they are a threat to Anglo-Saxon rule here, but also across the Pacific. And he knows that is something that's going to appeal to a large segment of who his audience is, which is prominent players in US politics, especially in the Senate, who they need, I believe it's 2/3 of the Senate for the treaty. This is why they exclude Asians from voting. This is why those restrictions go right into place with the bayonet constitution, as it's much more of a broad embrace of white supremacy. And it's here in these monologues. It's also in things like, I mean, the overthrow and of course, and the bayonet constitution themselves are just, they're explicitly about denying Kanaka the ability to rule over Hawaii. I mean, they're pretty clear about those, but it pops up in other places. It shows up. One of the reasons that they had, they whipped up all this anger for the bayonet constitution was that Kalakaua is sending an embassy to Samoa and then eventually to Tonga to try and get an agreement, basically to create an alliance, because hopefully it will be harder for people to gobble us up three together. But those sorts of connections between Hawaiians and Samoans and Tongans infuriate people, the white people in Hawaii, because that is for empire. I mean, that sort of, you can't go and have foreign relations. So that's one of the things that they constantly use to whip up anger, to get support for the bayonet constitution among the small group of people that are mostly armed white people that ended up supporting them. Armstrong is full of this stuff when he writes Around the World with the King, really explicitly talking about how Kalakaua's inability to grasp his own insignificance and Hawaii's insignificance is part of the problem with the Polynesian mind. And it's why they'll never be able to have grasp Anglo-Saxon rule in Hawaii, and that they're going to have to take over. And sorry, I have another W.O. Smith. This is him arguing for the Organic Act. And they wanted to put property requirements into the Organic Act for voting. And W.O. Smith says, unless some means are adopted to control the native vote, the territorial legislature would probably pass quickly into the hands of the natives, who are at that point the majority of the voting population. Let's see. And the only check upon their acts would be the veto of the governor. Without property qualifications, the government of the islands would be in the control of natives, to the great detriment of the interests of the whites and of the territory. And that's excluding completely Asian people from this argument completely. I mean, you already had strong political connections between Chinese in Hawaii and Hawaiians in Hawaii, and those are broken by the bayonet constitution. But this sort of thing is to continue breaking those and to push this small white rule. And I just had, sorry, one other thing I wanted to throw in there is when they're having the arguments over the Organic Act in the Congress, they're the supporters of the original version of the Organic Act that W.O. Smith and Morgan had written wanted these property requirements in there. And Senator Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina is arguing, he brings it up because the person who introduced this was Shelby Cullom of Illinois. And during all of the stuff that was going down in the South, the Southerners are pushing for property requirements, all this sort of thing, to keep Black people from voting. And the Republicans in the North are stopping that. And now Cullom is coming in and introducing something that will do the same thing to Hawaiians that he's stopping them from doing to Black people, or trying to stop the Democrats from doing to Black people in the South. And Tillman kind of points this out and says, you know, that before the senator leaves that part, I suppose the idea that the small minority of white people in Hawaii must be protected in their property and their civilization against the ignorance of the majority of colored people meets his hearty approval. And Cullom kind of laughs this off, and there's like laughing in the Senate, but they all agree that white supremacy is something that they can use for their own for their own projects and in the places where they want to suppress non-white votes. The only disagreements that they're having at this point, is whether or not Republicans or Democrats should benefit off of it in specific areas. Sorry, actually, this was the last one. This is John Williams, a representative from Mississippi. He notes that that part of the Organic Act is almost a transcript of the Mississippi Constitution and tending strongly toward the preservation of white supremacy and civilization in Hawaii. And that's the background for all of this. That's what's going on as sort of an embrace of what the US ruling mentality should be here, as well as in the United States itself. I will stop ranting now.
Mahalo, Kealani, for all of that. I'm going to move right on to Noenoe Silva with her monologue.
Mahalo. I have so much to say in response to that, Kealani, but maybe a little bit later. Just more evidence. But my remarks are a little bit different. I wanted to start off by saying something about our language, the Hawaiian language, Olelo Hawaii. So obviously the film is in English for good reasons, so that everyone can understand it and hear it. But I also think it's important to remember that this is our country. The language of our country is Olelo Hawaii, is Hawaiian. And at that time, even in the 1890s, the majority of people, if you wanted to do anything here, if you wanted to go in a store and buy something, engage a tailor, which my great-grandfather was in Honolulu, anything, you needed to speak Olelo Hawaii. Naturally, Pidgin was developing had developed actually quite well by that time on the plantations, but the basis of it is Olelo Hawaii. And so when we see Mr. Asing speaking, if we were to really think about what life was like at that time, he would have been speaking in Hawaiian or a Pidginized Hawaiian. During the trial of the Queen, the tribunal, it's well known that she refused to speak English at her trial. Why would she do that? She was perfectly, beautifully, elegantly fluent in English. She had been schooled in English from the time that she was a child. and she's very talented. She refused to speak English at her trial because she was insistent that this is our country. They were trying her most insultingly in her own throne room. And so that was one symbolic way that she could say, this is our country, I am the queen. This is my palace, and we'll speak in Olelo, Hawaii here. And so they had to translate that. And again, Emma Navahi and Kawēlauokealoha Campbell and everybody that was at that meeting, except the interpreter and Miriam Michelson, were speaking in Olelo, Hawaii. She had help. She was a reporter for the San Francisco Call, and she had help from Emma Navahi and the other people. Emma Navahi had her own newspaper, Kealani, and so they helped Michelson translate that so that it could translate what they said and what all of the people said, all those people that raised their hands and stood up and said, I love my country, translated that into English for her so it could be published in the San Francisco Call. So I just wanted to remind people of that because sometimes we forget. It seems so natural, right, that we're that we do everything in English, and we forget that it wasn't always like that. One other observation I wanted to make is that in a format like this, it was great to see to actually imagine. That was the Salvation Army Hall in Hilo is where that meeting took place, and to imagine the hundreds of people inside the hall, the hundreds of people outside the hall. But it strikes me that, when we have a sole actor or two actors, it seems like, and the way that Liliu is often represented as, trying to institute the new constitution by herself as a single actor. So I wanted to just bring up that from the Bayonet Constitution all the way through, the Ali'i were not alone. They were never alone. They were with their lahui. They were with the Hawaiian people who were with them all the way. Liliu did not write that constitution by herself. And she did not try to do any of that by herself. And, she was besieged with petitions to overthrow the Bayonet Constitution from the moment she took office, and Kalakaua had been besieged with many, many, many petitions from both women who could not vote at the time and men from the time the bayonet got put in until he died. So our ancestors were super organized, they organized into huis, and they supported the Ali'i, and they supported their country, and they got things done by organizing, kalo roots organizing. So, and then I just wanted to say one last thing quickly, and this follows along with what Kawēlauokealoha said, and also what Kealani said, and that is that it's always been about the land. A lot of reasons are put forward, both real and bogus, or justifications for why the Bayonet Constitution happened, why the overthrow happened, why the annexation happened. But really, what it's about is land. So the descendants of the missionaries and other haole people have come here. They're still coming here. And they want us out of the way. They want Hawaiians off of the land. They want to control the land. This was the case. And like I said, there's layers to it, right? So there's other sorts of economic things going on. There's economic depressions that happen in the United States that cause people to do things because of tariffs and all of that stuff. That's one level. The other level that's always there is that you have a beautiful, productive, strategically located, desirable, most expensive land. And we want it, and we want you off of it. And that has been the case since that time. It is the case today. We are still being removed off of our lands. And that's why you see the movements that we saw in 2019, and they will come back again, of trying to protect places. And I think we need even more of a movement. I think the movement that we need is to just simply be able to have places for Kanaka Hawaii to live in Hawaii. I think that is a movement that we need to start, because we have lots and lots of Kanaka who don't have a place to live in Hawaii, because this is still going on, and now it's called development and unaffordable housing. So, okay, thank you very much.
Hey, mahalo Noenoe. I think from listening to the three of you, one of my questions was going to be, what other parts of history do you think have been sidelined or covered over? And you've all talked about that. We've all brought out the particulars, the specifics that, far from being unimportant and small, are really inflection points in themselves. They're when events came to a stress point and broke in a certain way, and breaking that way influenced all the events that happened afterwards. The land use, 1895, that Kawēlauokealoha discussed. What tourists know about that? What tourists understand what had to happen in order for them to sit on the beach at Waikiki and look at the sunset? So I guess my question then, slightly amended to all three of you, would be, what should we, 21st century, be most cognizant of in our past in order to fix what's gone wrong? So being aware of the Land Act, the 1895 Land Act, for instance, furthers our understanding of how things have come to the point where, as Noenoe said, Kanaka do not have a place to live. So what other things should, let's go to education, should students be taught to be aware of so that they grow up to be the ones who make the change? Noenoe, you're on spotlight right now, so I'm going to ask you for a reaction.
You know, I think that, you know, the whole, this whole history, to be aware of colonialism and settler colonialism, and that it's not just here. This has happened in a lot of places, and it's still happening. So I think, you know, we need to educate people very young as to what this is about and what's happened. I would also say that as I'm currently researching in the Hawaiian language newspapers of the 20th century, it really strikes me that in the government ads, so one of the ways that the newspapers stay alive in the 20th century, as the number of speakers is dwindling and the number of subscribers to the papers keeps going down because there's fewer and fewer speakers because of the English language schools and all that. One of the ways that they stay alive is by printing the ads from the government. And overwhelmingly from what I've been reading lately is from 1930 to 1948, 90+% of those ads are selling off government lands. So all through the 1930s and 40s, they were selling off our land. And they're still selling off our land. So we lost a Supreme Court case to try to stop the sale of our government lands, which we never did cede. So there's a lie right in the vocabulary. They're called ceded lands. Nobody ceded them, except the Americans to the Americans. So anyway, it's that kind of stuff that we actually need more research on. I want somebody to go through and figure out what was going on there. Why were they selling so much land, right? And I think we also need to instill a sense of just a critical way of processing what we're seeing all around us, which is rampant construction that's out of control. Why is there so much construction all the time? And people say it's jobs, but the jobs are, I mean, the construction is destruction. It destroys land. And buildings don't stay forever in Hawaii. They get torn down constantly, so you can build new buildings. So I think we need to instill in young people a sense of like, instead of just sort of taking it for granted, these are the jobs, this is how we do things here. No, stop and say, why are we doing things that way? Sorry, noise, but you know, and start to think about what's really important, what sustains life, and what allows the Native people of Hawaii to continue to live here and be the Native people of Hawaii. Or my suggestions. I'm sure the other two have more or others.
Kealani or Kawēlauokealoha?
I've got a couple things to say. I think the challenging piece right now is that we still are in the process of uncovering all of this, right? It really is, when you look at the territorial period, which would be just post-overthrow going forward until faux statehood, and you look in the history books that are written and used to educate pretty much everybody, right? There's a lot of that is just simply not true. And so it's having to go back to the archives and dig all this stuff out and put the pieces of the puzzle back together. And I think that we're in the process of doing that, but we need more research. I think that something that everybody can do, though, is to always question what's going on around us currently and think about what the beginnings of this is, right? You can look at things like the TMT issue, Mauna Kea, and very easily connect that back to land laws, right? You can take, well, like Noenoe was saying, houselessness among Native Hawaiians and where we stand on the socioeconomic scale, right? And you can connect those dots. So I would just say that until we have enough people researching this so that we can actually tell the whole story from beginning to end and connect all the dots, that it's really important for people, all of us, including myself, right, to stay open and curious about how things ended up the way that they did. You know, there's so many examples around us, how much land the military has here in Hawaii. How did that happen, right? How did we end up bringing in so much of our food? What is it? It's over 90% of our food that we eat here, even though virtually like most things will just grow here. It's all of these things are connected to, a lot of them are connected to the territorial period. when everything really is changed completely, just radically changed from how the Hawaiian Kingdom government operated, which, so that would be my suggestion. I mean, I just think that we need more people researching and, but just to stay open and curious to what we see around us today.
I love that. To be a constant learner, to be curious enough to question what we're given, what we're taught, and try and find out things for ourselves. Yeah, cool. Kealani, do you have any comment here?
Yeah, I'm gonna be like, yes, territorial period. We do concentrate on the initial theft of 1893 and everything, but like all the rest of the theft continues on. And the territorial period is it's understudied, but it's definitely now becoming more and more studied. Social Process just did a special edition on the territorial period. Like there's a lot of research that's coming out now on the territorial period, but it's when a lot of the theft is done, like land theft, etc. And it's it's when the U.S. is established as when it sort of establishes itself in people's minds as I don't know, the accepted ruler of Hawaii. It takes a generation or two, but if you have enough schools, etc., pushing that, it happens. So there's a question on what is social process. So Social Process in Hawaii, yeah, it's a journal. I think it was just a special issue. They haven't been doing regular editions for a while. They just do these sort of special issues. But one of the things from the PG and the territorial period that I think is really interesting and it's fun, but it's the amount of corruption. Like when we think of okay, right now, think of how many stories have come out about corruption in Hawaii, and we tend to be like, oh, corruption in Hawaii is a contemporary thing. Well, it's been around since the early part of no government is going to be free of corruption, but from the provisional government onwards, it is part of rule, because corruption allows them to maintain a small group of this is how a kleptocracy works. It allows you to have a very small group that is benefiting from the theft, from this kleptocracy, and then those people will always support you. And to give you an idea of how bad the corruption is, in something like, I think there was 8 government officials, none of whom were elected, but 8 government officials that are appointed either by at the federal level or at the territorial level by Dole, get busted for either fraud or straight out embezzlement in something like a 7-month period. And we're not talking about they're running off with $10. One dude ran off with $17,000 that they just put into his safe because Dole needed someplace to put money that wasn't really on the books. And so they took all this money out of the bank, put it in a safe, and they just kind of took it in when he needed cash to run the government. But the corruption is part of how Hawaii runs today. The corruption was part of how Hawaii ran then. And I think a better understanding of that then helps us understand how we got to where we are today. And then the last thing is this kind of gets into this weird space of like, it's not really history, but to think about the lost potential of where Hawaii was going and what Hawaii could have been without the bayonet and the overthrow, but also more broadly, what the Pacific could have been without this sort of mad dash for empire. You have Samoa and Tonga trying to achieve the same level of diplomatic recognition. Tonga had, a peaceful, stable government for longer than the United States had at that point, just because of the Civil War. And what could all of that have looked like? What the Pacific could have looked like today if we hadn't faced that long period under these various kleptocracies. Because the guys who were running Samoa were the same level of this mix of incompetence and embezzlement. The same thing in most of the Pacific. I mean, they didn't send their best to come and colonize us. We got the B-listers really. Yeah, I'll end there.
Okay, I gotta write that down. Didn't send the best to colonize. Yeah. So the could have been Kealani. There's so many ways you could go with that, but the now, what we're dealing with now is what we've got. The resistance of the Native Hawaiian communities, the various communities, to the overthrow, to annexation in particular, is fascinating reading. And it's impressive because of the sheer numbers of people who are resisting. So I would ask now, what resistance is happening? We have the obvious. We have the TNT, the Mauna protests. But what do you see happening now, and what potential do you see for resistance?
If you don't mind me jumping in.
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to point out that what I'm finding in the territorial period is not all just loss, and it's not. It's not, Hawaiians aren't sitting around, letting people run over us. We did get overwhelmed, like completely overwhelmed, because, as Kawēlauokealoha said, because of this land act where we had just thousands upon thousands of people, and they still never stopped coming. They're still coming, and they're not just sitting on the beach, they're owning things. But anyway, the story of the 20th century, of the territorial period, for me is, despite all of that happening, despite all the land being sold, Waikiki being, having our food systems taken away from us, that's really one of the big stories of the 20th century, is the water diversion and the ending of our food systems. But what was also happening was that there were some people who were really heroic, who were determined to keep our language going, for one thing, and to keep the aspects of our culture going. So maybe, we look back, maybe there weren't enough of them, but people have to survive. People have to go to work and feed their families and do the best that they can. But there was a ton of Hawaiians working as hard as they could, the regular job in the day, in the night, writing in Hawaiian, figuring out, trying to, get classes going all over the place. So this is a story that I'll be writing and probably publishing some journal articles on in the near future. Those people is what allowed us to have the language in the shape that it's in today. So we went from a low of a very few speakers, say by 1960, maybe might have been a low point. I'm not sure. Maybe it was 1970 was the low point. Maybe even 1980 might have been the low point, somewhere in there. But then, because we have so much, and our recent ancestors, went out, Kawena Pukui and then Larry Kimura, I will always be grateful to them, always, forever, for just taping as many native speakers as they possibly could. They worked so hard. And then other people were just writing until they couldn't do it anymore. And so because of all that hard work, we're able to educate like thousands and thousands and thousands of people to speak Olelo Hawaii today. This is a triumph. We should be really proud of ourselves, you know, because of this. And also the education that's going on. When I was in graduate school, you know, I actually had a list, Kealani Cook and I had a joint list of all the Hawaiian PhDs we knew in the world. We actually could count them. You cannot count them anymore. So we've been doing a bang up job, and we should be proud of ourselves and keep going and doing these really positive things. So we can't get our country back right this minute. It's not possible, but we're doing all of these great things to prepare ourselves. And it's not just, I want to say, it's not just protest. It's not just resistance. We're doing these things to thrive and all of that. So I wanted to get that in there. And when, you know, and I was also really, really proud of us, of all of us in 2019 and 2020 for such an effective protection movement to protect Mauna Kea. And we had some losses on some other things, but I think we learned so much from that when we have to go back up there, which maybe we won't, although David Lausner at the university keeps telling us every week that he's going to build his TMT. So we may go back, but we did really well. And so we need to believe in ourselves and believe in our recent ancestors and the good work that we can do and take care of ourselves.
I think that's a really good point, that when you talk about language and how long it took to build back up to the point where now you have entire schools, you have a theater department speaking Hawaiian. But the point that I get from that is triumph is not one moment. Triumph is a process. And I'm really glad that you are turning it around from my word of resistance, because that just implies such adversarial stuff. Whereas if you're working on developing your own people and having triumph in the process, it's much more positive. So, Kealani or Kawēlau?
Can I say a couple things? One is, you know, I'm a geographer, and I get asked all the time about the erasure of place names, right? Since we're talking about language, I think it's important to sort of think about reclaiming our place names. And it's possible to do. It's possible to do. As a geographer, you know, I'm so excited at the prospect of, you know, it's unlikely that I'm going to be the one that does this work, but I'm so excited because the record keeping of the kingdom, of the Hawaiian Kingdom government, was amazing. And because the systems that they put into place, for instance, the Mahele of 1848 and the 1950 Kuleana Act, right, in which land commission awards are given out for commoners, those processes had a system that documented and codified all of these place names, down to, I mean, we named everything, okay? We named everything. In these documents, you see, I'm testimony saying something like, I'm claiming this land, this is who's to the east of me, this is who's to the west of me, and it runs along the boundary of a stream, and the stream's name is this, and there's a rock on this side, or a taro patch, or a fish pond, and all of these things have names. They were so specific because these, especially with the Kuleana Act, they had to provide these testimonies, and there had to be a survey done at the time. So you can actually go back and with some level, I mean, I'm not going to say that you can pinpoint the exact boundary of these places, but you can come pretty darn close using GIS technology of reclaiming where these places were. And, even though those places are not there anymore, right? These boulders that had names, sometimes hills that had names because they had historical significance. Just because they're not there doesn't mean that we shouldn't remember them, right? These Inoa Vahi, these place names are like kupuna to us. They really are. And there is a way to reclaim a lot of this stuff. And so while a lot of my work talks about erasure, I will agree with Noenoe that there's a lot that we can recover and reclaim and begin to use. And in that way, right? In that way, when I see somebody put here, Hunana Niho, right? This is a very good example. Once we start calling these places by their real names, that is an act of resistance that any of us and all of us should be doing. And so I really encourage people to do a little bit of research. A lot of times you can just go online and see, or old maps, right? A lot of these old maps also, because we did surveying in the kingdom very, very early on. There's all of this, all of this amazing, valuable, all of this treasures, all of these place names that are out there. And if we begin to use them, all we do is ho'omana them or build them up as our kupuna.
Mahalo. Mahalo. That's wonderful. Kealani, any thoughts?
Yeah, so two things. One, in terms of resistance, one of the things, one of the reasons that we're able to point out most of this stuff out is that throughout this entire period, like all the corruption and all the land deals and everything, Hawaiians and others are they're constantly pointing these things out and preserving them in congressional records. Kuhio publishes this massive broadside against he's a Republican, but against the Haole side of the Republican Party for land theft and water theft. And he creates a civil war in the hierarchy of the Republican Party in Hawaii over these issues of land and water. So one of the things, like, there was so much resistance, is just one of the reasons we have these things, that we can build off of stuff. So they also preserve the evidence there of all of these things. So there's so much that was done, and with an understanding often that, like, we won't be able to win now, but we can win later on. So we'll preserve everything. And then this is going to be a little bit when I'm thinking about potential, and that idea of, like, potential for the kingdom and for the Pacific. One of the things to think about is, for instance, Kalakaua was the kingdom was one of the first to get the Japanese to allow migration, to allow migrants out because of their poor treatment in earlier migration, including in Hawaii. There was a tendency of real fear that if Japanese migrants go someplace and are treated poorly, it reflects back poorly on Japan itself. And one of the ways Kalakaua is able to convince the emperor and the foreign minister to allow migration to Hawaii is by saying, well, we have laborers. I'm not looking for laborers. What we're looking for are citizens. We're looking for people to be part of Hawaii. And one of the things that we've lost because of the overthrow and annexation is the ability to imagine what it would be like. What does a Hawaii look like where, instead of becoming Japanese Americans, that generation of kids became Japanese Hawaiians, right? Which is happening with the Chinese with intermarriage. And we see this, on the outskirts. But after 1900, a lot of that is taken away. A lot of that potential is taken away. I mean, if you look at even, there's a tendency to be like, oh, the Japanese didn't intermarry into Hawaiian families. If you look at, I think it was 1908, the Kamehameha School's graduating class, like my great grandpa was in there, and part of the first football team. But they two of the Hawaiian boys in there are Japanese, right? And so there's already like we see this in Hawaiian communities, not like within Native Hawaiian communities, like there's a lot of sort of marriage, etc. Was one way of bringing people in, but there's all these different ways that you can, as a people, as a nation state, of making someone into part of you, of incorporating people, etc. And those are all stripped out after 1900. And that's one of the potentials that's lost. And this actually goes back to things that you're seeing in resistance today, is that there seems to be more, and going back to Mauna Kea, a lot of the people who were up there weren't Kanaka, but they were down to fight for it. And more people in Hawaii who are not Kanaka are in like finding worth and value for themselves and for the broader community in Hawaiian knowledge, in Hawaiian activism. And I mean, there's many ways of reclaiming that potential now. And I mean, the younger generations are kind of already doing that. But it's, we lost 100 years of being able to do that. And now we're seeing some of that, like we're seeing the possibilities for that. I mean, just of those connections, those community and personal connections as a form of resistance to if you come in, you will become American, versus if you come in, well, how do you connect to Hawaiians? And that as a way of belonging here, rather than belonging here because you're an American. Yeah.
Mahalo. Yeah, social process, indeed. We have just a couple of minutes left. I want to mahalo all of you for sharing your ike, your mana'o. Yeah, I'm very appreciative. Do you have any closing statements for our audience? Noenoe.
I just want to mahalo the audience. So there's been a running conversation going on in the chat, where there's a lot of good information being traded and a lot of really good mana'o. So I want to thank everybody that attended. And I just want to say to Kealani and Kawēlau, you guys are awesome. You're so brilliant. Oh my God. I hope you folks are doing writing and publishing. I know Kawēlau, you're doing dissertation, but again, can't wait to read that. But anyway, you two are brilliant, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you. Aloha, everybody.
Aloha.
I will just say one thing. I completely starstruck on this panel. So mahalo to my co-panelists, but also to the audience. Really incredible mana'o going on in the chat. Yeah, mahalo.
I just want to echo what you guys said, and I should note that, like Kawēlau said, the starstruck thing, the first 2 times I met Noenoe Silva, I couldn't get words out because I was like, oh my God. So yeah, this is super fun. And we don't forget that Hawaii is not just Hawaii. Hawaii is part of the Pacific. and then broader, we are part of a world. And to one of the things that's really interesting is the more you learn about Pacific history, you will understand Hawaiian history too. So don't forget to learn about Pacific history. Through a pitch, we have Pacific history classes on all the campuses. And also I want to say hi to my kids, who I think may be watching right now.
Mahalo. Mahalo to all three of you. And I want to tell our audience that if you would like to watch this again, or if you would like to catch up on other videos during this Hawaiian History Month that you have not seen, they are all archived on the Hawaii Pono Coalition website. So you'll be able to watch them again. Thank you so much for joining us on this last program of Hawaiian History Month. Na Huliau has turned out to be not just turning points on stage, but turning points in our lives as individuals and communities. The Hawaii Pono Coalition does not produce these months by itself. We have other members who have been incredibly supportive. Kamehameha Schools, Friends of Kealani Palace, the Association of Hawaiian Civic Clubs, Papaʻola Lokahi, UHM John A. Burns School of Medicine, Department of Native Hawaiian Health, Ahahui o Nakauka, Center for Biographical Research at UHM Hawaii Nui Akea School of Hawaiian Knowledge, UHM Department of Theater and Dance, Native Hawaiian Bar Association, Hawaii Youth Opera Chorus, OEV TV, Olelo Community Media. In addition to the members, we have what we call partners who have been equally instrumental in supporting this month. Office of Hawaiian Affairs, Kanai Okana, Pam Omidyar, Liliuokalani Trust, Ahui Sivila Hawaii Le Ali'i Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center, Kawaya Ha'o Church, Bidi Kanahele Dawson, Ronald Williams Jr., PhD, George Kahumoku Jr., Mana Music Quartet, Inamea Hawaii, Mana Maoli, Mana Ikoleo, and Native Hawaiian Student Services. Now, before we go, there were some questions in the chat, and let me scroll up. I think one of them was about place names. Where is it? Okay, this question came in. How do the panelists feel about place names being decided by a committee of 7 to 8 members, that is, the Hawaii Board on Geographic Names? Any responses to that?
I can answer that if you like. This is Noenoe. The purpose of the board isn't to decide on place names. The main work of the Hawaii Board on Geographic Names is to determine and correct the spelling of names. Occasionally, they do make decisions on certain things. For example, the original name of Wailuku River was Wailuku Kahawai o Wailuku River. And in the territorial periods, when they took all the water out of there, some surveyor wrote Iao Stream on a map, and it became Iao Stream. Nawai'eha then petitioned the Hawaii Board on Geographic Names to restore the name of Wailuku River, especially since some of the water had come back. And so the board did decide to do that. And then the one time that they actually decided on a name was Fisher 8, which was part of that 2018, 17-18 eruption. And that was a community process. So people in the community suggested names. There was a bunch of meetings and conversations, and then the board decided. But those are exceptions. Generally, what the board does is do research and basically correct the spelling of incorrect names and restore names. And then that information goes to the United States Geological Service. And then it also goes to the state of Hawaii, but they're not making up any names generally.
Could I add something to that too?
Yes, geographer.
When they decide or correct the spelling, right, that is supposed to inform how the street signs and other signs like that are produced. But there somehow is a disconnect that happens because we have a lot of street names and place names that are still spelled incorrectly. So I just wanted to point that out because I think it's great that we have the board, but I would love to see more follow through so that visitors and all of us get very familiar with seeing the diacritical markings and understanding what they mean. I think that pronouncing these streets, which are many of them are named after our ali'i, like these are really important. They're not just denoting what street you're on. So I just really want to, to voice my opinion on that. Thank you.
Okay, mahalo.
Only the mandate is only to the state of Hawaii, but the state of Hawaii can also be very resistant. Like one of the things was that the state of Hawaii officially does not have an okina in the word Hawaii. And it would take an act of the US Congress to restore the okina to the official name of the state. And so anyway, I think that the state legislature could probably do something, but nobody wants to do that. And then the thing is that whatever the board is a state board. So whatever they correct or whatever, the city and county of Honolulu or the county of Maui or the, Hawaii County, they don't have to pay any attention to it. Only state agencies are mandated. And then they'll just be like, well, we have 62 years of letterhead here, so we're not going to change it. Or that's too expensive, so we're not going to change it.
Okay, on that cheery note, again, mahalo to all of you, and really mahalo for sharing your ike with all of us. Our audience, mahalo for joining us, and tune in again next year. Aloha.